The day the world changed. Picture this moment frozen in time. June 8th, 793. The morning sun climbs over the North Sea, casting golden light across waters that have been peaceful for generations. On a small island off the northeastern coast of England, monks at Lindisfarne Priory are beginning their daily prayers. These men have dedicated their lives to God, to scholarship, to preserving the knowledge of the ancient world in their manuscripts. They believe they are safe here, protected by their faith and by the sea itself. They have no idea that on the horizon, cutting through the morning mist like knives through silk, longships are approaching, ships unlike anything these monks have ever seen, dragon heads carved into their prows, striped sails billowing in the wind, and inside these vessels, warriors who will change the course of history forever. The Vikings are coming. But here is what most people do not understand about that moment. This was not just a raid. This was not simply an attack by barbaric pirates looking for easy plunder. What happened at Lindisfarne that day was the announcement of a new age. It was the moment when warriors from the frozen north declared to the world that they would no longer be ignored, no longer be isolated, no longer accept their place at the edges of civilization. The blood spilled on those monastery stones was just the beginning of a story so epic, so transformative, that it would reshape Europe, reach across oceans, and echo through 1,000 years of history. Who were these people really? Where did they come from? What drove them to leave their homes and terrorize the known world? And perhaps most importantly, why do we still talk about them today, more than a millennium after the last Viking drew his final breath? The answers to these questions are more complex, more fascinating, and more relevant than you might imagine. Because the Vikings were not just raiders. They were explorers who reached America 500 years before Columbus. They were traders who connected east and west. They were settlers who founded cities and kingdoms. They were poets and artists. They were lawmakers who influenced modern democracy. They were farmers and craftsmen. They were human beings living in one of the harshest environments on Earth, trying to survive, trying to thrive, trying to make sense of a brutal world. This is their story, not the sanitized version, not the Hollywood fantasy, but the real, blood-soaked, storm-tossed, heart-pounding truth about the people who emerged from Scandinavia and seized their place in history with both hands and refused to let go. Progression, the making of the Vikings. The land that forged them. To understand the Vikings, you must first understand the land that created them. Scandinavia in the 8th century was not a place for the weak. Picture Norway, Sweden, and Denmark before the modern age. Imagine endless winters where the sun barely rises, where temperatures plunge so low that exposed skin freezes in minutes. Imagine summers that are brief and precious, where every moment of warmth must be used to grow enough food to survive the coming cold. Imagine mountains that pierce the sky like the bones of ancient giants, fjords that cut deep into the coastline like the scars of old battles, forests so dense and dark that they seem to swallow light itself. The soil was thin and rocky. Farming was backbreaking work with little reward. The growing season was short, the harvests uncertain. A bad year meant starvation. A good year meant survival, nothing more. The sea was both provider and destroyer, giving fish but taking lives with storms that could appear without warning. Bears, wolves, and bitter cold were constant threats. Simply living through winter was an achievement. Raising children to adulthood was a victory against impossible odds. This environment did something to the people who survived it. It made them hard. It made them resourceful. It made them fearless, not because they were unafraid of death, but because death was always so close that fear became pointless. You cannot live in terror every day of your life. Either you break or you become something stronger. The Scandinavians became stronger. They learned to work together because survival alone was impossible. They learned to innovate because old methods meant death. They learned to take risks because safety was an illusion anyway. But there was something else this harsh land gave them. It gave them a hunger for something more than mere survival, a hunger for wealth, for glory, for a chance to prove themselves worthy of the songs that would be sung about them after death. Because in Viking culture, death was not the end. Death was just a transition. And the way you lived, the deeds you accomplished, the reputation you built, these things determined where you went after death and how you would be remembered. This was not abstract philosophy. This was the driving force of an entire civilization. The ships that changed everything. Now let us talk about the technology that made it all possible, because without their ships, the Vikings would have remained isolated farmers and fishermen unknown to history, but with their ships, they became unstoppable. The Viking longship was not just a boat. It was a masterpiece of engineering that would not be matched for centuries. These vessels were built using techniques passed down through generations, refined over centuries of trial and error. The Vikings used oak for strength and flexibility. They overlapped the planks in a method called clinker building, which made the hull both lightweight and incredibly resilient. The ships could bend and flex with the waves rather than fighting against them. They could survive storms that would shatter other vessels. But the true genius was in the design. Viking longships had a shallow draft, meaning they did not sit deep in the water. A ship carrying 30 warriors might draw only 3 feet of water. Do you understand what this meant? It meant they could sail up rivers that other ships could not navigate. It meant they could land on beaches without need for a harbor. It meant they could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear before any defense could be organized. Their enemies were fighting an enemy that could materialize from nowhere and vanish like smoke. The ships were fast, incredibly fast. Under sail, they could reach speeds of 15 knots or more. Under oars, with a full crew pulling in rhythm, they were nearly as swift and far more maneuverable. They could sail into the wind using techniques that would not be rediscovered in Europe for centuries. They could cross the North Sea, the most treacherous waters in the world, with confidence. They could navigate by the sun, the stars, by the color of the water, by the patterns of waves, by the flight of birds. Viking navigators developed an almost supernatural ability to find their way across vast expanses of empty ocean without compass or map. Each ship was more than a tool. It was a work of art. The prows were carved into dragon heads or serpent shapes, designed to frighten enemies and honor the gods. The shields of warriors were mounted along the sides, creating a wall of color and symbolism. The sails were often dyed in bright patterns, marked with the symbols of the crew. When a fleet of longships appeared on the horizon, it must have been a sight of terrible beauty, death approaching with grace and speed. These ships allowed the Vikings to do what no other European people could do. They could raid Ireland in spring, trade in Francia in summer, and return home for harvest in autumn. They could explore west to Iceland and Greenland. They could sail east through Russian rivers all the way to Constantinople and Baghdad. They could go anywhere the water touched, and water touched everything that mattered. Let us talk about the warriors themselves, because the reality is both more mundane and more terrifying than the myths. Not every Viking was a warrior. Most were farmers who occasionally went raiding. But when they did go to war, they were formidable beyond measure. Training began in childhood. Boys learned to fight with wooden swords almost as soon as they could walk. They wrestled, they practiced with spears, they learned to swim in freezing water and to endure pain without complaint. Physical toughness was not optional. It was survival. A man who could not defend himself, his family, and his home was not a man at all in Viking eyes. He was thrall material, a slave, less than human. The weapons they used were simple but devastatingly effective. The spear was the most common weapon, cheaper than a sword and in many ways more practical. A good spear had a reach advantage over nearly any other weapon. It could thrust, it could be thrown, it could be used in tight ship combat or in open field battles. Viking spears had broad blades designed to cause maximum damage. They were not ceremonial, they were killing tools. The axe was another favorite. Most households had axes for chopping wood, and in Viking hands, these became weapons of terrifying power. The bearded axe, with its distinctive curved blade, could hook an enemy's shield and pull it aside, exposing them to a killing blow. A Viking warrior skilled with an axe could split a helmet and the skull beneath with a single strike. Battle axes were balanced perfectly for combat, light enough to swing rapidly, heavy enough to break through armor and bone. And then there were the swords. Oh, the swords. These were not common weapons. A good sword cost as much as a farm. They were heirlooms passed from father to son, given names like leg biter and skull splitter. Viking swords were pattern welded, meaning the blade was made from multiple strips of iron and steel twisted and forged together. This created a blade that was both flexible and hard, that could bend rather than break, that could hold an edge through an entire battle. The patterns in the steel were visible on the blade, creating swirling designs that seemed almost magical. Some warriors believed their swords had souls, that they hungered for blood, that they sang in battle. Armor was less common than Hollywood would have you believe. Mail shirts, made from thousands of interlocking iron rings, were expensive and rare. Most warriors fought in leather armor or thick woolen clothing. Helmets were conical and made from iron, designed to deflect blows rather than absorb them. The famous horned helmet is a myth, by the way. There is zero archaeological evidence that Vikings wore horns into battle. That image came from romantic artists in the 19th century who wanted to make the Vikings look more barbaric and exotic. The shield was perhaps the most important piece of equipment. Viking shields were round, made from wooden planks covered in leather with an iron boss in the center. They were not passive defense. They were weapons in their own right. A shield could deflect a sword stroke, block an arrow, bash an enemy in the face, or be used to create a shield wall, where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier that could advance or hold ground as needed. But the true weapon of the Vikings was not steel or iron. It was their mindset. They fought with a ferocity that terrified their enemies. They believed that dying in battle was glorious, that warriors who fell with weapons in hand would be carried by Valkyries to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until the end of the world. This was not metaphor. This was literal belief. Death in battle was not something to fear. It was something to seek. This made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. How do you fight an enemy who wants to die gloriously? How do you intimidate men who believe the greatest honor is to fall in combat? There was also the phenomenon of the berserkers. These were warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, seemingly immune to pain, capable of incredible feats of strength and violence. The word berserker means bear shirt, possibly referring to warriors who wore bear or wolf skins into battle. Modern scholars debate what caused this state. Some suggest it was mushrooms with psychoactive properties. Others think it was ritualistic frenzy induced through meditation and psychological preparation. Some believe it was simply extreme adrenaline and cultural expectation. Whatever the cause, berserkers were real, and they were terrifying. Chronicles from their enemies describe warriors who bit their shields, who fought with inhuman strength, who seemed to feel no pain from wounds that would drop a normal man. The society that sent them forth. Now we need to understand the society that produced these warriors and sailors, because Viking culture was far more complex than the simple raider stereotype suggests. Viking society was organized into roughly 3 classes. At the bottom were the thralls, the slaves. These could be people captured in raids, debtors who could not pay their debts, or people born into slavery. The life of a thrall was hard. They had no rights, no property, no hope of advancement. They did the work that no one else wanted to do. They could be bought, sold, beaten, even killed with little consequence to the owner. Slavery was an accepted part of Viking life, and raids were partly motivated by the need to capture people who could be sold in slave markets across Europe and the Middle East. Above the thralls were the carls, the free farmers. This was the largest class in Viking society. These were the people who owned land, who had rights, who could speak at assemblies and seek justice for wrongs done to them. Carl's status was valuable and protected. A carl could not be enslaved easily. He had the right to bear arms, to own property, to marry freely. Most Vikings were carls. They farmed their land, raised families, participated in their communities, and occasionally went raiding or trading. Being a carl meant having honor, having status, having a place in society. At the top were the jarls, the nobles. These were wealthy landowners, war leaders, men of power and influence. Jarls led raids and commanded loyalty from lesser men. They settled disputes, they organized defense, they represented their people in dealings with other communities. The line between jarl and king was sometimes blurry. A successful jarl with enough followers might declare himself a king. A weak king might find himself reduced to jarl status or worse. Viking society was highly patriarchal, but women had more rights and independence than their counterparts in most of medieval Europe. Women could own property, inherit wealth, divorce their husbands if they were unhappy, and run households and farms while men were away on raids or trading expeditions. Some evidence suggests that a few women may have even been warriors, though this is hotly debated among scholars. What is clear is that Viking women were not helpless or passive. They were managers, decision-makers, and vital participants in their society. The Vikings had no centralized government, no unified nation in the modern sense. Instead, they organized around family groups and local assemblies called things. The thing was where disputes were settled, where laws were made, where justice was administered. Anyone could speak at a thing if they had standing. This was a form of early democracy, though limited to free men. The thing could decide on punishment for crimes, approve or reject proposed marriages, settle property disputes, even declare war or peace. The laws were not written down initially, but were memorized and recited by law speakers who held the entire legal code in their heads. Justice in Viking society was harsh, but had its own logic. The concept of weregild was central. If you killed someone, you did not necessarily face execution. Instead, you might be required to pay compensation to the victim's family. The amount depended on the victim's status. Kill a thrall and you paid little. Kill a jarl and you paid a fortune. If you could not or would not pay, blood feud could result, where the victim's family had the right to seek vengeance. This could lead to cycles of killing that went on for generations, wiping out entire families. Outlawry was another punishment. A person declared an outlaw lost all rights and protections. Anyone could kill them without consequence. They could not seek shelter or help. They were literally outside the law, as the term suggests. For a people who valued community and belonging as the Vikings did, outlawry was a fate worse than death. It meant exile, isolation, the loss of everything that made life worth living. Religion permeated Viking life. They worshipped the Aesir, the gods of Asgard, Odin the All-Father, seeker of wisdom, god of war and death and poetry, Thor the Thunderer, protector of mankind, wielder of Mjolnir, Freya, goddess of love and fertility and war, who claimed half the slain warriors for her hall, Tyr, god of justice and law, Loki the trickster, neither fully god nor fully giant, agent of chaos and change. The Vikings believed the gods were flawed, that they could be petty and cruel, that they struggled and suffered like humans, that they would eventually die at Ragnarok, the end of all things. This belief system shaped Viking behavior. If the gods themselves were not guaranteed to survive, why should humans expect eternal safety? If Odin sought wisdom through suffering, hanging himself on the world tree to gain knowledge of the runes, then what price was too high for achievement? If Thor fought giants to protect humanity, then warriors fighting enemies were doing the same work. The myths were not just stories, they were templates for how to live. Sacrifice was important. Animals were sacrificed to ensure good harvests, successful voyages, victory in battle. There are controversial accounts of human sacrifice, though scholars debate how common this was. What is clear is that the Vikings believed the gods required offerings, and they were willing to give what was necessary. Death customs reveal a lot about Viking values. When an important person died, they were often buried in a ship, surrounded by grave goods they would need in the afterlife. Weapons for warriors, tools for craftsmen, jewelry for wealthy women. Some grave contained sacrificed animals or even human servants, though this was not universal. The most spectacular burial discovered is at Oseberg in Norway, where a ship containing 2 women and elaborate grave goods was unearthed, giving us incredible insights into Viking art and culture. The explosion across Europe. Now we come to the period that made the Vikings famous and feared across the known world. The late 8th century through the early 11th century, roughly 250 years of expansion that changed Europe forever. After Lindisfarne in 793, the raids continued and intensified. The Vikings had discovered that the monasteries and churches of Christian Europe were filled with wealth and defended by men who would not fight back. These were perfect targets. Gold and silver that had been accumulated over generations, beautiful metalwork, precious stones, all concentrated in locations that were isolated and vulnerable. The Vikings hit them again and again. Ireland was particularly ravaged. The Irish had no unified Dufansa. The island was divided into dozens of small kingdoms constantly warring with each other. The Vikings exploited this ruthlessly. They raided, they established bases, they eventually founded settlements that would become major cities. Dublin was a Viking creation, founded as a trading post and slave market. Cork, Limerick, Waterford all have Viking origins. The Vikings in Ireland did not just raid and leave. They settled, intermarried with the Irish, adopted some Irish customs while maintaining their own identity. They became Hubknunasa, neither fully Viking nor fully Irish, something new. England faced similar invasions. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were wealthy and divided, perfect targets. In 865 something changed. The great heathen army arrived. This was not a raiding party. This was an army, thousands of warriors intending to conquer and settle. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, according to legend, the army ripped through England, destroying kingdoms, killing kings, seizing land. Within a few years, most of England was under Viking control, an area called the Danelaw. Only Wessex held out, under the leadership of Alfred, who would be called the Great. Alfred fought a desperate guerrilla campaign, hiding in swamps, striking from nowhere, slowly building strength. Eventually, he managed to halt the Viking advance and negotiate a peace that divided England between Anglo-Saxon and Viking control. The Vikings who settled in England became farmers, they built towns, they converted to Christianity, they intermarried with the English. Within a generation or two, the line between Viking and Anglo-Saxon was blurring, but they did not lose their martial culture. These descendants of Vikings would play crucial roles in English history for centuries. France faced similar devastation. The Vikings sailed up rivers deep into the heart of France. They besieged Paris multiple times. The Frankish rulers tried everything to stop them. They built bridges to block rivers, they paid enormous sums of silver as bribes, they fortified cities. Nothing worked consistently. The Vikings were too mobile, too persistent, too hungry. Finally, in 911, the Frankish king made a desperate deal. He gave a Viking leader named Rollo a huge territory in northern France, on the condition that Rollo convert to Christianity and defend the coast against other Vikings. Rollo agreed. That territory became Normandy, land of the Northmen. These Christianized Vikings became the Normans, who would later conquer England in 1066 under William the Conqueror. The Viking influence continued, transformed but still powerful. Scotland and the islands around Britain became Viking strongholds. The Orkney and Shetland Islands were thoroughly Scandinavanized. The Hebrides became mixed Norse-Gaelic cultures. The Kingdom of the Isles, controlling much of western Scotland, was essentially Viking in origin. These communities persisted for centuries, maintaining Norse identity long after the Viking Age officially ended. But the raids were not limited to these areas. The Vikings struck Spain and Portugal, though the Muslims there proved fierce opponents, and the pickings were not as easy as in Christian lands. They raided into the Mediterranean, attacked settlements in Morocco, Italy, even as far as Constantinople. Everywhere they went, they gained wealth, knowledge, and terror-inducing reputation. The eastern route to riches. While the Danes and Norwegians were terrorizing Western Europe, the Swedes looked east. They saw opportunity in the vast rivers of Eastern Europe and Russia. They loaded their ships with trade goods and warriors and sailed across the Baltic Sea. These Eastern Vikings were called the Rus, and they would give their name to Russia itself. They traveled down the Volga River and the Dnieper River, portaging their ships overland when necessary, establishing trading posts and fortified settlements along the way. They made contact with the Byzantine Empire, the remnant of Rome that still controlled Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world. They reached the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic empire that stretched from Spain to India. The Byzantines called the Vikings Varangians. They were impressed and terrified by these tall, fierce warriors from the north. Eventually, the Byzantine emperors formed the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Viking and later Anglo-Saxon warriors who served as personal bodyguards to the emperor. This was one of the highest honors a warrior could achieve, serving in Constantinople, seeing the wonders of that magnificent city, protecting the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Vikings traded furs, honey, wax, and slaves for silver, silk, spices, and wine. The amount of Arab silver that made its way back to Scandinavia was enormous. Archaeologists have found thousands of Islamic coins in Viking hordes across Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. This silver financed the Viking expansion, allowed them to build ships, equip warriors, maintain their way of life. But they did not just trade peacefully. They also raided and extorted. The Vikings attacked Constantinople itself multiple times, though the massive walls and Greek fire, a terrifying incendiary weapon, prevented them from taking the city. They raided down the Volga, attacking settlements and demanding tribute. Local rulers learned to pay the Vikings for protection, creating relationships that were part trade agreement, part extortion racket. The Vikings also became rulers in the east. The Rus established kingdoms centered on Kiev and Novgorod. These Scandinavian warriors became the ruling elite of Slavic populations, gradually adopting local customs and language while maintaining their warrior culture. The Rurik dynasty, supposedly descended from a Swedish Viking, ruled parts of Russia for over 700 years, not ending until the time of Ivan the Terrible. This eastern connection is often overlooked, but it was enormously important. It connected northern Europe to the great civilizations of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. It allowed ideas, technologies, and goods to flow between east and west. The Vikings were not isolated barbarians. They were cosmopolitan traders with connections spanning from Greenland to Baghdad. The discovery of new worlds. While some Vikings were raiding churches and trading in Constantinople, others were sailing west into the unknown Atlantic. This is perhaps their most extraordinary achievement, one that has been overshadowed by the violence of the raids, but deserves recognition as one of humanity's great exploratory accomplishments. Iceland was uninhabited when the Vikings found it in the late 9th century. There may have been a few Irish monks living in isolation, but no permanent population. Norwegian Vikings fleeing political turmoil at home began settling the island. By 930, Iceland had a population of tens of thousands, organized into independent farms scattered across the habitable parts of the island. They brought sheep, horses, and their entire cultural system. Iceland became a unique Viking society, with no king, governed entirely by the Althing, a general assembly where all free men could speak. This made Iceland arguably the world's oldest existing parliament. From Iceland, a man named Eric the Red explored further west. Eric was a violent troublemaker who had been exiled from both Norway and Iceland for murder. In 982, he sailed west and discovered a massive island. He named it Greenland, in what might be history's first real estate marketing scam. The name was meant to attract settlers, suggesting lush green land. The reality was mostly ice and rock. But there was some habitable land on the southwestern coast, with grass for grazing and protection from the worst storms. Eric convinced hundreds of Icelanders to follow him to this new land. At its peak, the Greenland Viking settlements had around 5,000 people living in isolation on the edge of the world. Life in Greenland was incredibly hard. The growing season was even shorter than Iceland. They could not grow grain, so they survived on livestock, fish, seals, and trade goods. They exported walrus ivory, polar bear hides, and narwhal tusks back to Europe. They had to import iron and timber because Greenland had virtually none. Despite the hardships, the settlements survived for nearly 500 years before eventually failing, likely due to climate change, economic collapse, and conflict with the Inuit. But the most astounding discovery was yet to come. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland. According to the sagas, he had heard tales of land sighted by a Viking sailor who had been blown off course. Leif decided to investigate. He sailed west and found land. He explored the coast, finding 3 distinct areas he named Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. The exact locations are debated, but most scholars agree these were Baffin Island, Labrador, and Newfoundland. At a place called Elance Orks Meadows in northern Newfoundland, archaeologists have found undeniable evidence of Viking settlement: building foundations, iron nails, a bronze cloak pin, a spindle whorl, artifacts that prove beyond doubt that Vikings reached North America around the year 1000, 500 years before Columbus. They were the first Europeans to set foot in the Americas, the first to establish a settlement, the first to meet the indigenous peoples. The Vikings called the natives they encountered Skraelings. Relations were initially trading-based, but eventually turned violent. The sagas describe battles between Vikings and natives. The Vikings had superior weapons and armor, but they were vastly outnumbered. The settlements in North America did not last long. The distance from Greenland was too great, the resources required too much, the native resistance too fierce. Within a few years or decades, the Vikings abandoned their North American colonies. But they had done something extraordinary. They had crossed an ocean, found a new continent, and proven that the world was far larger than anyone in Europe imagined. The arts of peace. To understand the Vikings fully, we must look beyond war and exploration to see what they created, what they valued in times of peace. Viking art was distinctive and beautiful. They carved intricate designs into wood, bone, and stone. They created jewelry that combined precious metals with sophisticated techniques. The style evolved over time, but common elements included interlaced patterns, animal motifs, and geometric designs. Viking metalworkers could create incredibly delicate filigree work, tiny details that required magnification to fully appreciate. They made brooches, arm rings, neck torques, all showing extraordinary craftsmanship. Their poetry was sophisticated and complex. The Vikings had skalds, professional poets who composed elaborate verses praising kings and heroes, commemorating battles, preserving history. Old Norse poetry used complex metaphors called kennings. A warrior might be called a feeder of ravens because his battles left corpses for the birds. The sea might be the whale road. Blood might be battle sweat. These were not simple descriptions, but artistic choices that required skill to craft and intelligence to appreciate. The sagas are among the greatest literary achievements of medieval Europe. These were stories of heroes and kings, of family feuds and quests, of exploration and tragedy. They were initially oral traditions, memorized and recited, but eventually written down in Iceland. The sagas are remarkably realistic. Heroes are flawed, good people suffer, villains have understandable motivations. Fate is unavoidable, but fought against anyway. Reading the sagas today, you encounter complex characters, moral ambiguity, psychological depth that feels utterly modern. Viking craftsmanship extended to everyday objects. Their ships were works of art, but so were their comms, their buckets, their furniture. They built longhouses from timber and turf, structures that could house entire extended families plus servants and animals under one roof. These buildings were smoky and dark by our standards, but they were warm and communal, places where people gathered to tell stories, make plans, and survive the long winters together. They were innovative in practical ways. Viking navigators developed the sun compass and may have used sunstones, crystals that could locate the sun even on cloudy days by detecting polarized light. They created detailed mental maps of the North Atlantic, passing knowledge from generation to generation. They understood tides, currents, and weather patterns in ways that allowed them to navigate when others would be hopelessly lost. Viking traders connected distant markets. They brought English wool to Constantinople, Byzantine silk to Scandinavia, Frankish swords to Dublin, Russian furs to Baghdad. They were middlemen in a vast commercial network that spanned the known world. This trade enriched Viking society, brought new ideas and technologies home, and demonstrated that the Vikings were not simple barbarians, but sophisticated participants in global commerce. The transformation and conversion. As the 10th century progressed, Viking society began to change. The catalyst was Christianity. The religion that the Vikings had terrorized for over a century slowly, inexorably converted them. The conversion process was complex and often violent. Christian missionaries ventured into Scandinavia, some dying as martyrs, others successfully gaining converts. Kings who converted to Christianity gained political advantages. They could make alliances with Christian European powers. They could claim divine right to rule, not just personal strength and the loyalty of warriors. They could use the church's administrative capabilities to strengthen their governments. Norway was converted largely through the efforts of Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, both kings who used a combination of persuasion and violence to spread Christianity. They burned temples, destroyed idols, executed or exiled those who refused to convert. Saint Olaf, as Haraldsson became known, was particularly zealous. His methods were brutal but effective. Within a generation, Norway was nominally Christian. Denmark's conversion was more gradual. King Harald Bluetooth converted and famously raised a massive runestone declaring that he had Christianized the Danes. Sweden was the last to convert, not becoming fully Christian until the 12th century. Even after official conversion, old beliefs persisted. Archaeological evidence shows that many Vikings wore both Thor's hammers and Christian crosses, hedging their spiritual bets. Christianity changed Viking society fundamentally. The warrior culture that glorified death in battle conflicted with Christian teachings about peace and forgiveness. The cycle of blood feuds was supposedly replaced by Christian notions of mercy and legal justice. Polygamy, common among wealthy Vikings, was forbidden under Christian monogamy rules. Slavery, while not immediately abolished, was increasingly questioned and eventually declined. But perhaps most importantly, Christianity brought literacy. The Vikings had runes, which were used for short inscriptions, magical purposes, and markers, but not for extensive writing. The Latin alphabet and monastic tradition of recording information transformed Scandinavian culture. The sagas were written down, laws were codified, history was preserved. The oral tradition, with its flexibility and uncertainty, was supplemented by written records. The Kingdoms and the decline. As Christianity spread and consolidated, the Viking Age entered its final phase. The raiders and explorers became kings and subjects of organized kingdoms. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden emerged as recognizable nations with borders, governments, and international relations. The process was violent. Petty kings fought to establish dominance. Harald Fairhair supposedly became the first king of a unified Norway in the late 9th century, though his control was limited and disputed. Denmark was unified under Gorm the Old and expanded aggressively under later kings. Sweden's unification was slowest and most contested, not truly solidifying until long after the Viking Age ended. These new kingdoms were more like their European neighbors than like the Viking society of earlier centuries. They built stone churches instead of wooden temples. They established monasteries and bishoprics. They created formal legal codes. They minted coins and collected taxes. They participated in European politics as equals rather than as terrifying outsiders. The famous Viking raids became rarer. Partly this was because the Vikings had converted to Christianity and were less willing to raid fellow Christians. Partly it was because European defenses had improved. Fortifications were better, armies more organized, naval forces more capable. The element of surprise and technological advantage that the Vikings had exploited for centuries was gone. Raiding was no longer profitable enough to justify the risks. Trade replaced raiding as the primary means of gaining wealth. Viking merchants were welcomed in ports across Europe. Their language evolved, adopting words from Latin, Old English, French. Their culture became less distinct, more European. The fearsome raiders became respected neighbors. The Greenland colonies began to fail. Climate change brought colder temperatures that made farming even more difficult. Trade with Europe became sporadic. The Inuit moved south and came into conflict with the Vikings. Around 1400, the last Greenland Vikings either died out or left. Their fate remains somewhat mysterious. Did they starve? Did they migrate? Were they killed? We do not know for certain. The colony simply disappeared, leaving behind ruins and questions. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is sometimes marked as the end of the Viking Age. The Normans, descended from Vikings but thoroughly Frenchified and Christianized, defeated the Anglo-Saxons at Hastings. Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Viking warriors, died trying to conquer England. That same year it was a symbolic moment. The descendants of Vikings fought each other for control of England. And when the dust settled, the victor was more Norman than Norse, more Christian king than Viking raider. The final stand and the eternal legacy. We have reached the culmination of our saga, the moment where we must confront what the Viking Age truly meant and why it still matters over 1,000 years after the last dragon ship sailed into battle. But first, let me take you to a moment that captures the entire arc of Viking history in a single, brutal confrontation. The Bridge of Destiny. September 25th, 1066. Stamford Bridge in England. This is where the Viking Age effectively ended, in blood and chaos and defiant courage that perfectly embodied everything the Vikings represented. Harald Hardrada, whose name means hard ruler, was perhaps the last true Viking hero. He was a giant of a man, reportedly over 6 feet tall when the average height was much less. He had been a Varangian guard in Constantinople, a mercenary in the Mediterranean, a king in Norway. He had fought in a dozen countries, survived countless battles, accumulated vast wealth and greater fame. He was 50 years old, ancient by Viking standards, and he was not done seeking glory. He had come to England with 300 ships and thousands of warriors, invited by a rebellious English earl who promised support. Harold planned to seize the English throne, adding England to his Norwegian kingdom. For days, things went well. He defeated an English army, seized York, and seemed poised for victory. Then he heard that the English king, Harold Godwinson, was approaching with an army that had marched an astonishing 185 miles in just 4 days. Harold Hardrada made a fateful decision. He had left much of his armor and many of his men back at the ships. The day was hot. A battle seemed unlikely. He chose not to call for reinforcements, not to don heavy mail. It was a mistake that would cost him everything. The English army appeared suddenly. Harold's forces had to fight immediately, unprepared, outnumbered, separated from their main strength. According to legend, a single Viking warrior held the bridge over the river Derwent, killing 40 Englishmen before being slain by a spear thrust from beneath the bridge. That warrior bought time for Harold to organize his lines, but not enough time. The battle was vicious. The Vikings formed shield walls and fought with all the courage and skill they possessed, but they were exhausted from their earlier victory. They lacked armor, they were outnumbered. Harold Hardrada fell, struck in the throat by an arrow. He died standing, weapon in hand, exactly as a Viking should. His warriors continued fighting around his body, refusing to retreat, accepting death rather than dishonor. The English offered quarter to the surviving Vikings. Those who remained were so few they filled only 24 ships of the original 300. The survivors sailed home, bearing the body of their king, carrying the news that the age of Viking conquest was over. But the story does not end there. 3 days later, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast of England. Harold Godwinson, his army exhausted from fighting Harold Hardrada, had to march south immediately to face this new threat. At Hastings, Harold fell, his forces defeated. William the Conqueror took the English throne. The irony is perfect. A descendant of Vikings defeated the English king who had just defeated the last Viking king. The Viking influence on England did not end at Stamford Bridge. It simply changed form. The thread that never broke. Here is the truth that most people miss about the Vikings. They did not disappear. They transformed. Their DNA, their culture, their influence wove into the fabric of Europe and beyond so thoroughly that we cannot separate them from the modern world. Look at language. English is a Germanic language heavily influenced by Old Norse. Hundreds of common English words come directly from the Vikings. Sky, egg, knife, want, take, ransack, husband, law, window, these are not obscure technical terms. These are basic words that you use every day without knowing you are speaking the language of the Vikings. Place names across England, Ireland, and Scotland are Norse in origin. Any town ending in by, thorp, or thwaite was founded by Vikings or in Viking-controlled areas. The Vikings left their genes wherever they settled. Modern genetic studies show significant Scandinavian ancestry in Britain, Ireland, Iceland, parts of France, Russia, and even among some Native American populations in Canada descended from Inuit who had contact with Greenland Vikings. You might be part Viking without knowing it. Millions of people are. Their legal innovations influenced the development of democratic institutions. The Thing system, where free men could speak and vote, contributed to concepts of trial by jury and representative government. The idea that law should be transparent, memorized, and recited publicly so everyone knew their rights and responsibilities. This was revolutionary in an age when laws were often arbitrary and hidden. The very word law comes from the Old Norse word lag. The Viking settlement of Normandy led directly to the Norman conquest of England, which transformed English society, law, architecture, and government. The castles, the feudal system, the integration of French and English culture, all can be traced back to that Viking settlement in northern France. The Viking exploration of the North Atlantic demonstrated that the ocean was not an impassable barrier. They proved that ships could cross vast distances, that new lands existed beyond the known world. When Columbus sailed west 5 centuries after Leif Erikson, he was following a path the Vikings had already pioneered. The age of exploration, the colonization of the Americas, the creation of the modern globalized world, all have roots in those early Viking voyages. The Viking influence on Russia was enormous. The Rus established trade routes, founded cities, created the beginnings of the Russian state. The very name Russia comes from these Scandinavian adventurers. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople showed that Vikings could serve foreign powers while maintaining their identity. The concept of elite foreign military units, mercenaries who are loyal because they are outsiders with no local political ties, this became a recurring feature of military history. Viking shipbuilding techniques influenced naval architecture for centuries. The clinker-built hull, the shallow draft, the single-mast design, these innovations were studied and adapted by shipbuilders across Europe. The Viking ability to navigate without modern instruments, using stars and sun and natural indicators, represented a peak of traditional seamanship that has only recently been fully understood and appreciated. Their art influenced medieval European design. The interlaced patterns, the animal motifs, the combination of abstract and representational elements, these appeared in illuminated manuscripts, in church decoration, in jewelry and metalwork throughout Europe. The ringerike and urn styles, developed in late Viking Age Scandinavia, were copied by Christian artists who recognized their beauty even if they despised their pagan origins. Why we still talk about them? Let us ask the fundamental question. Why do the Vikings fascinate us today? Why do we make movies and television shows about them? Why do sports teams name themselves after Vikings? Why does the image of the Viking warrior, brave and free and defiant, appeal to people 1,000 years removed from that culture? Part of it is the adventure. The Vikings lived lives of epic scale. They sailed into the unknown, they fought desperate battles, they explored distant lands, they took enormous risks. In our modern world of safety and predictability, there is something appealing about people who embrace danger as a way of life. We are drawn to their courage, even as we are repelled by their violence. Part of it is the freedom. Viking society was brutal and hierarchical, but it also had elements of independence and self-determination that feel modern. A skilled warrior or trader could rise regardless of birth. A man could seek his fortune in distant lands. Women had more autonomy than in most medieval societies. The Thing system gave common people a voice in governance. These were not modern democracies, but they had seeds of ideas that would eventually flower into concepts we value today. Part of it is the mystery. Despite extensive research, much about the Vikings remains unknown. Their motivations, their emotions, their daily thoughts are lost to time. We have artifacts and sagas, but we do not have their voices explaining why they did what they did. This gap allows us to project our own meanings onto them, to see in them what we want to see. They become mirrors reflecting our own values and fears. Part of it is the aesthetic. Vikings created beautiful objects, powerful images, memorable symbols. The longship with its dragon prow, the warrior with his axe and shield, the runes carved into stone, these are visually striking in ways that resonate across cultures and centuries. The Viking look, whether historically accurate or not, has become iconic, instantly recognizable, powerfully symbolic. But I think the deepest reason we remember the Vikings is this. They represent the idea that ordinary people can become extraordinary through courage and will. The Vikings were not superheroes. They were farmers and fishermen living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They had every excuse to stay home, to accept their limitations, to live small lives and die forgotten. Instead, they built ships and sailed into the unknown. They challenged empires and refused to accept anyone's claim that they were inferior. They made themselves legendary through sheer audacity and determination. The Vikings teach us that background does not determine destiny, that poverty does not mean powerlessness, that being from nowhere can become being from everywhere. They show us that a small population with limited resources can change the world if they are willing to take risks and endure hardship. In an age when many people feel powerless, when the individual seems crushed by vast impersonal forces, the Vikings remind us that individuals matter, that small groups can achieve great things, that courage and skill can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The final Viking voyage. Let me tell you about one last Viking, a man who embodies everything we have discussed. Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, was born around 995. He was a Viking of the old school, raiding England and France as a young man, fighting for anyone who would pay, living by his sword and his wits. But he was also a Christian, converted in Normandy, genuine in his faith even if his methods were violent. He returned to Norway and made himself king through a combination of political maneuvering and military force. As king, Olaf tried to transform Norway. He spread Christianity aggressively, violently suppressing paganism. He attempted to centralize power, to create a real kingdom rather than a loose collection of independent chieftains. He made laws, established churches, fought against slavery and blood feuds. He was trying to turn a Viking society into a Christian European kingdom. Many Norwegians hated him for it. They resented his Christianity, his authoritarianism, his attempts to change their traditional ways. He was too much of the old Viking way for Christian Europe and too much of the new Christian way for traditional Vikings. He satisfied no one. Eventually, he was forced into exile, fleeing to Russia. But Olaf was not content to remain in exile. In 1030, he gathered an army and returned to Norway, determined to reclaim his throne. He knew the odds were against him. He knew he would probably die. But he came anyway, because a king does not die in exile and a warrior does not accept defeat without one more fight. At the Battle of Stiklestad on July 29, 1030, Olaf faced an army of Norwegian rebels supported by the Danish king. He was outnumbered. Many of his men were foreign mercenaries with no real loyalty. The battle was short and brutal. Olaf fought in the front rank, as Viking kings did, leading his men rather than commanding from safety. He fell, struck down by multiple wounds, dying on Norwegian soil fighting for the crown he had lost. The story should end there. A failed king, dying in a lost cause, rejected by his own people. But something extraordinary happened. Almost immediately, miracles were attributed to Olaf. Springs that bubbled up where his blood fell supposedly had healing properties. People who prayed at his grave reported cures for illness. Within a year, he was declared a saint. The same Norwegians who had fought against him began to venerate him. Within a generation, he was the patron saint of Norway, his feast day celebrated as a national holiday, his name given to sons throughout Scandinavia. What does this mean? Why did Olaf, who failed as king, succeed as saint? Because he represented something that Norwegians needed. He was the bridge between Viking past and Christian future. He was fierce and brave and willing to die in battle, the perfect Viking warrior. But he was also Christian and lawful and opposed to the chaos of the old ways. He was both things at once. In death, he could represent the transformation that Norway was undergoing, the painful process of becoming something new while honoring what had been. Olaf's story is the story of the Viking Age itself, a transformation, violent and difficult, that turned raiders into kingdoms, pagans into Christians, isolated northerners into Europeans. The old ways died, but they did not disappear. They were absorbed, transformed, preserved in new forms. The Viking spirit, the courage and ambition and restlessness did not vanish. It just found new expressions. The eternal return. On the shore of the North Sea, the wind still blows cold. The waves still crash against rocks worn smooth by millennia of water and ice. In Norway, Sweden, Denmark. The land still challenges anyone who lives there, demanding resilience and ingenuity to survive. But the longships are gone. The dragon grows exist only in museums and reconstructions. No raiding parties will sail up the rivers of England or France. No more warrior kings will die in battle seeking glory and Valhalla. That age is over, finished, concluded. And yet, in Iceland, the All Thing still meets, the direct descendant of Viking assemblies from over 1,000 years ago. In Scandinavian countries, people celebrate midsummer and other festivals that have echoes of pre-Christian traditions. In cities around the world, people with Scandinavian heritage wear Thor's hammers or bear tattoos of Viking designs. In universities, scholars study Old Norse, analyze sagas, excavate archaeological sites. In popular culture, Vikings appear again and again, reinvented for each new generation. Vikings survive because we need them to survive. We need the reminder that people can overcome desperate circumstances. We need the example of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. We need the lesson that small nations and poor peoples can leave marks on history that last forever. We need the image of the longship sailing into unknown waters, the crew not knowing what they will find but going anyway, because the alternative is to never know, to never dare, to never become more than you are. The blood that was spilled at Lindisfarne has long since washed away. The treasure looted from 1,000 monasteries has been spent, lost, melted down, scattered to the winds. The warriors who sailed in dragon ships have been dust for centuries. The gods they worshipped are no longer believed in, except by small groups of modern pagans. The language they spoke has evolved into modern Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, Icelandic, barely recognizable to what they would have known. But the story remains. The saga of the Vikings, of a people who refused to accept their fate, who built ships and sailed into the unknown, who fought against empires and reached across oceans, who created poetry and art and laws, who lived with such intensity that their age shines across the centuries like a beacon fire on a distant shore. This story will not die as long as humans tell stories. When you speak English and use words of Norse origin, you are speaking the language of the Vikings. When you participate in democratic governance, you are using ideas they helped develop. When you explore and take risks and refuse to accept limitations, you are living the Viking spirit. When you face adversity with courage and determination, you are honoring their memory. When you create beauty in harsh circumstances, you are following their example. The Vikings came from nowhere, from frozen lands at the edge of the world, from poverty and hardship that should have kept them small and isolated. They became legends. They became the people that other peoples feared and admired and remembered. They sailed further, fought harder, explored deeper, dared more than anyone thought possible. They took the world by storm, literally and figuratively, and when the storm passed, the world was forever changed. This is what we learn from the Vikings, not that violence is glorious, not that conquest is admirable, but that human potential is limitless, that circumstances do not determine destiny, that courage and skill and will can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that the human spirit, when tested to its limits, can not only endure but transcend. The Viking Age lasted roughly 250 years, from the raid on Lindisfarne to the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a quarter of a millennium, a brief moment in human history, but in that moment, a people from the frozen north exploded across the known world and left marks that will never be erased. They discovered America 5 centuries before Columbus. They founded cities that still exist today. They created art and literature that still moves us. They influenced languages, laws, and cultures across half the globe. They proved that no ocean is too wide, no enemy too strong, no goal too ambitious if you are willing to risk everything to achieve it. The dragons on the prows of their ships were meant to frighten enemies and honor gods, but they also symbolized something deeper. They represented the untamed, the wild, the refusal to be ordinary. They represented the belief that humans could be more than simple farmers and fishermen, that they could be adventurers and conquerors and explorers and legends. Those dragon ships sailed into history and never returned, but the spirit that built them, that propelled them across impossible distances, that gave courage to men who faced death knowing they might never come home, that spirit lives on. It lives on in everyone who refuses to accept limitations, in everyone who dares to explore beyond the known, in everyone who believes that they can change their circumstances rather than simply accepting them. The Vikings matter because they show us what humans can accomplish when they combine courage with skill, ambition with determination, and the willingness to risk everything with the intelligence to maximize their chances. They were not perfect. They were violent, often cruel, sometimes barbaric by our standards. But they were also brave, loyal to their chosen companions, curious about the world, creators of beauty, seekers of glory, and they lived lives of such intensity and impact that we still talk about them more than 1,000 years later. In the end, is that not what we all want? To matter, to be remembered, to have lived a life that meant something beyond simple survival. The Vikings achieved this. They came from harsh lands at the edge of the world, and they made themselves immortal through deeds and courage and the refusal to accept obscurity. The last Viking warrior died centuries ago. The last Viking ship rotted away long before Columbus sailed. The last speaker of true Old Norse has been silent for generations. The gods of Asgard no longer receive sacrifices or prayers from any significant number of believers. But the Vikings endure. In our language, our laws, our genes, our imaginations, our aspirations, they endure because their story is fundamentally human. A story about struggle and triumph, about courage and skill, about the refusal to accept limits, about the determination to leave a mark on the world no matter the cost. This is why we tell their story. This is why we remember them. This is why, when we think of adventure and exploration and courage, we think of dragon ships cutting through northern seas, of warriors standing in shield walls refusing to retreat, of explorers sailing into unknown oceans, not knowing what they would find, but going anyway. The Vikings were people just like us. They felt fear and doubt. They questioned their decisions. They mourned their losses. They loved their families and friends. They worried about the future, but they did not let fear stop them. They did not let doubt paralyze them. They did not let limitations define them. They built ships and sailed into the storm. They faced impossible odds and fought anyway. They explored unknown lands and survived. They created beauty in harsh circumstances. They made themselves legendary through force of will and strength of character. And the lesson, the final message of the Viking Age is this: you can do the same. You can overcome your circumstances. You can refuse to accept limitations. You can take risks and survive. You can leave your mark on the world. You can become legendary in your own life, in your own way. The storm the Vikings unleashed changed the world forever. The blood they spilled soaked into the earth of a dozen nations. The paths they sailed across the oceans opened routes that would be followed for centuries. The kingdoms they founded still exist. The laws they established still influence us. The stories they told still entertain and inspire us. More than a millennium has passed since the last Viking raid, since the last dragon ship sailed in conquest, since the last warrior fell believing he would feast in Valhalla. But the echo of that age reverberates still. It reverberates in every person who refuses to accept their station, in every explorer who sails toward the unknown, in every warrior who stands against impossible odds, in every creator who makes beauty despite hardship, in every dreamer who believes they can change the world. The Vikings were mortal. They died. Their civilization transformed into something else. Their moment in history ended. But their spirit, the essence of what made them who they were, that can never die, because it is a fundamental part of the human condition. The urge to explore, to conquer, to achieve, to be remembered, to matter. This is not specifically Viking. This is human. The Vikings simply embodied it so completely, so intensely, so successfully that they became the symbol for these impulses. When you face a challenge that seems insurmountable, remember the Vikings who sailed across the North Atlantic in wooden ships held together with iron nails and courage. When you feel limited by your circumstances, remember the farmers from Norway who became kings in Russia and warriors in Constantinople. When you doubt whether you can make a difference, remember that a few thousand raiders from the edge of the world changed the course of European history. When you wonder if your life will matter, remember that the Vikings made themselves immortal not through seeking immortality, but through living so intensely, so courageously, so memorably that people could not forget them even if they wanted to. The Viking Age is over. Long live the Viking spirit, the spirit that builds ships and sails into storms, the spirit that stands in the shield wall and refuses to retreat, the spirit that explores beyond the known, the spirit that creates beauty in the harshest circumstances, the spirit that refuses to accept that this is all there is, all there can be, the spirit that believes in something greater than mere survival. The spirit that seeks glory, not for its own sake, but because glory means that you mattered, that you lived, that you were here and you made a difference. This is the eternal legacy of the Vikings, not the violence, not the raids, not the conquest, but the example, the proof, the demonstration that ordinary people from nowhere can become legends through courage and skill and the refusal to accept limitations, that the world is full of possibilities for those brave enough to seize them, that death comes for everyone, but some people make their lives count for so much that they never truly die. The blood and the storm have passed, but the saga continues, in every generation, In every person who hears their story and thinks, if they could do that, what might I accomplish? If they could overcome such odds, what excuses do I have? If they could change history, why cannot I change my own life? The dragon ships sailed into legend. The warriors marched into memory. The age of the Vikings ended. But the story, the magnificent, terrible, inspiring story of the people who came from the frozen north and conquered the world, this story will be told as long as humans tell stories, because it is not just their story. It is our story. The story of what humans can achieve when we dare greatly, when we refuse to surrender, when we believe that we can be more than what we are. The Vikings live forever, not in Valhalla, not in any afterlife, but in the echoes they left behind, in the words we speak, in the laws we follow, in the lands they discovered, in the cities they founded, in the blood that runs through millions of veins, in the imagination of everyone who hears their story and feels something stir inside, some ancient recognition of kindred spirits across the centuries. They sailed into the storm and emerged as legends. They came from nothing and became everything. They lived brief, violent, glorious lives and made themselves eternal. This is the power of the human spirit when fully unleashed. This is what we can accomplish when we dare to be great. This is the legacy of the Vikings. This is their gift to us across 1,000 years. Not wealth or territory or conquest, but example. The example of people who refused to be forgotten, who lived so intensely that their age shines like fire across the dark centuries, illuminating what humans can be at their most brave, most ambitious, most alive. The saga is complete. The story has been told, but it never truly ends, because somewhere right now, someone is hearing about the Vikings for the first time and feeling that spark of inspiration. Someone is learning that these people from nowhere became legends and thinking, maybe I can too. Someone is facing their own storm and remembering that the Vikings sailed into storms and survived. Someone is finding courage in a story that is more than 1,000 years old, but somehow still immediate, still relevant, still powerful. This is immortality, not living forever, but creating something that lives forever in the hearts and minds of others. The Vikings achieved this. They became eternal through deeds and courage and the sheer audacity to believe that they mattered, that they could change things, that they could be great. And they were right, they did matter. They did change things. They were great, not perfect, not admirable in every way, but great, undeniably, unforgettably, immortally great. The wind still blows cold across the North Sea. The waves still crash against the rocky shores of Scandinavia. But the longships are gone, the warriors are dust, the age has ended, and yet the Vikings remain. In story and song, in memory and imagination, in inspiration and aspiration. They remain because we need them to remain, because their story tells us something essential about human potential, about courage, about the refusal to accept limits. They were Vikings, they were legends. They were mortal humans who made themselves immortal through the simple act of living so courageously, so memorably, so magnificently, that we cannot forget them even after 1,000 years. This is their legacy, this is their gift. This is what the blood and the storm have left behind. Not just history, but inspiration. Not just facts, but meaning. Not just a story, but a truth about what humans can accomplish when we dare to be extraordinary. The Viking age is over, but the Viking spirit lives on. In you, in me, in everyone who hears their story and feels that ancient call to adventure, to courage, to greatness. The ships may be gone, the warriors may be dead, the gods may be silent, but the saga continues. It continues in everyone who refuses to accept their limitations, in everyone who sails into the unknown, in everyone who stands against impossible odds, in everyone who believes they can be more than what they are. The Vikings proved it is possible. They proved that people from nowhere can become legends. They proved that courage and skill can overcome any obstacle. They proved that a few determined individuals can change the course of history. They proved that greatness is not about where you start, but about how far you are willing to go. This is the final lesson of the Viking Age, the ultimate truth that their story teaches us across the centuries. You do not need to be born special to achieve special things. You do not need advantages to overcome disadvantages. You do not need permission to be great. You just need courage. Courage to try, courage to risk, courage to believe that you can matter that you can make a difference, that you can leave your mark on the world. The Vikings had this courage, they had it in abundance, and they used it to transform themselves from obscure farmers at the edge of the world into legends that would be remembered for over 1,000 years. They did not wait for the world to recognize their worth. They seized recognition with their own hands. They did not ask for permission to matter. They made themselves matter through force of will and strength of deed. You can do the same, not by raiding and pillaging, obviously. Those days are thankfully over, but by living with the same courage, the same determination, the same refusal to accept that this is all there is, by daring to explore your own unknown oceans, by standing firm against your own impossible odds, by creating your own beauty in harsh circumstances, by making your own legend in your own way. The blood spilled by the Vikings has long since dried. The storms they sailed through have long since passed. The world they changed has changed again 1,000 times over. But the essential truth remains. Humans are capable of extraordinary things. We can overcome impossible obstacles. We can achieve legendary feats. We can matter. We can leave marks that outlast our brief lives. We can be remembered. We can be great. The Vikings proved this. They lived it. They embodied it so completely that they became the symbol for human courage and ambition for all time. When we think of brave explorers, we think of Vikings. When we think of fierce warriors, we think of Vikings. When we think of people who defied the odds and made themselves legendary, we think of Vikings. And in thinking of them, in remembering them, in being inspired by them, we keep them alive. We ensure that their story continues. We guarantee that their legacy endures. We prove that they achieved what they sought, not just to survive, not just to prosper, but to matter, to be remembered, to live forever in the stories told about them. They succeeded, completely, totally, undeniably. More than 1,000 years after the last Viking drew breath, we still speak their names. Harald Hardrada, Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, Ragnar Lothbrok, Saint Olaf. These names echo across the centuries, carrying with them stories of courage and adventure that still have the power to inspire, to move, to transform. This is the power of a life well lived. This is the reward for courage and daring, not material wealth, though they sought that too, not comfortable old age, which few Vikings achieved, but immortality, true immortality, the kind that matters, the kind where your story outlives your body by 1,000 years or more, where your deeds inspire people you will never meet, in ages you could never imagine, in ways you could never predict. The Vikings achieved this immortality. They earned it with blood and courage and an unwillingness to accept the limits that geography and poverty and harsh climate tried to impose on them. They refused to be nobody. They refused to be forgotten. They refused to accept that their lives were insignificant. And through that refusal, through the courage it took to act on it, they made themselves the most remembered people of their age. Kings and emperors from that same period are forgotten. Wealthy merchants are lost to history. Comfortable people who played it safe and died peacefully in their beds are nameless dust. But the Vikings endure. The raiders, the explorers, the warriors who risked everything and often lost everything, they are remembered. They are celebrated. They are studied. They matter. This is the paradox, the lesson that many people never learn. Safety does not lead to immortality. Comfort does not create legends. Playing it safe guarantees only that you will be safely forgotten. The Vikings understood this at a deep level. They knew that life was short and brutal and death was certain. The only question was what you did with the brief time you had. Would you survive quietly and die forgotten? Or would you dare greatly, risk everything, and possibly, just possibly, achieve something worth remembering? They chose the latter, again and again, generation after generation. They chose to sail into storms rather than stay safe on shore. They chose to fight against impossible odds rather than submit peacefully. They chose to explore unknown oceans rather than accept their isolation. They chose to make themselves legendary rather than die anonymous. And it worked. Against all odds, it worked. They became exactly what they sought to be, legends, heroes, the people whose stories would be told 1,000 years later. And here we are, more than a millennium removed from their age, still telling those stories, still inspired by their courage, still awed by their achievements, still learning from their example. The Vikings succeeded beyond even their wildest imaginings. They wanted to be remembered by their children and grandchildren. They are remembered by the entire world. They wanted their names to live on for a few generations. Their names and deeds are known globally more than 40 generations after they died. They wanted to matter to their small communities. They matter to all of human civilization. This is what courage can achieve. This is what refusing to accept limitations can create. This is what happens when people dare to be extraordinary. The Vikings were not born special. They were born into poverty and hardship in one of the worst environments on Earth. They had every excuse to remain small, to accept their lot, to survive quietly and die forgotten. They had no advantages, no wealth, no obvious path to greatness. But they had courage and ingenuity and determination and the unwillingness to believe that where you start determines where you end. They built ships from the forests around them. They learned to sail by trial and error, losing many ships and men in the process. They created weapons and armor from limited resources. They developed tactics and strategies that overcame their numerical disadvantages. They turned their weaknesses into strengths. Their ships were small and light because they could not build huge vessels, but this made them fast and maneuverable. They raided because they could not conquer large armies, but raids were often more effective anyway. They explored because they needed resources, but exploration led to discoveries that mattered more than any plunder. They made the best of what they had. They turned obstacles into opportunities. They refused to let circumstances dictate their destiny, and in doing so, they changed not just their own lives but the course of history. They did not just survive, they thrived. They did not just endure, they conquered. They did not just exist, they mattered. This is what we learn from the Vikings in the end. Not that violence is good, not that conquest is admirable, but that human potential is limited only by human courage, that circumstances are challenges, not destiny, that where you come from matters less than where you are willing to go, that limitations are suggestions, not absolute boundaries, that greatness is possible for anyone brave enough to pursue it. The Vikings came from the frozen north, from lands of ice and stone and endless winter. They had no natural advantages. They were not born special. They did not have destiny on their side. They were just people trying to survive in impossible conditions, looking for something more than mere existence. And from that beginning, they became legends that would outlast empires, that would be remembered longer than dynasties, that would inspire people across 1,000 years and counting. If they could do that, what can you do? If they could overcome such odds, what excuses do you have? If they could make themselves immortal through courage and deeds, why cannot you make your own mark in your own way? You have advantages they never dreamed of. You have resources beyond their imagining. You have opportunities they would have killed for. What is stopping you from being great in your own right? Not from raiding and conquering. Those days are past and good riddance, but from exploring your own frontiers, from overcoming your own obstacles, from refusing to accept your own limitations, from daring to believe that you can matter, that you can make a difference, that you can leave your mark on the world in ways both large and small, from living with courage and purpose and the determination to be more than you are right now. This is the eternal gift of the Vikings, not their violence or their conquests, but their example, the proof that ordinary people can become extraordinary, that limitations can be overcome, that greatness is possible, that courage matters, that daring to be different, to take risks, to sail into the unknown can lead to achievements that echo across centuries. The Viking Age began with a raid on a monastery. It ended with a battle on a bridge. Between those bookends, a people from nowhere became legends. They sailed across oceans. They founded kingdoms. They discovered continents. They changed languages. They influenced cultures. They became immortal, not through divine intervention, not through magic or destiny, but through courage and skill and the refusal to accept that they were destined to remain poor farmers at the edge of the world. They decided they would be more, and then they made it happen, through blood and sweat and countless sacrifices, through storms and battles and defeats and victories, through sheer determination and unwillingness to quit. They made themselves great. They made themselves legendary. They made themselves eternal. And 1,000 years later, we still tell their story, we still remember their names, we still learn from their example, we still find inspiration in their courage. They achieved exactly what they sought. They mattered. They were remembered. They became the heroes of sagas that would be sung long after their deaths. They succeeded beyond measure. They won their immortality through deeds that have become timeless. The wind blows cold across the North Sea tonight, just as it did 1,000 years ago. The waves crash against the same shores, the same stars wheel overhead. But the world is different because the Vikings lived, because they dared, because they refused to accept limits, because they sailed into the storm and became legends. This is their story, the story of blood and storm, of courage and conquest, of exploration and achievement, the story of people who came from nothing and became everything, the story of the Vikings, the story that teaches us that greatness is possible for anyone brave enough to pursue it, the story that proves human potential is limited only by human courage, the story that shows us what we can become if we dare to be extraordinary. The saga is complete, the story has been told, the Vikings have had their say. Now the question is, what will you do with the inspiration their story provides? Will you play it safe and be forgotten, or will you dare greatly and perhaps, just perhaps, become legendary in your own right? The choice, as it always has been, is yours. The Vikings made their choice. They chose greatness. They chose courage. They chose to matter. And they succeeded so completely that we still celebrate them a millennium later. What will your choice be? What mark will you leave? What story will be told about you? The Vikings have shown us what is possible. The rest is up to us, to each of us, to sail our own seas, fight our own battles, explore our own unknowns, and perhaps, if we are brave enough and skilled enough and determined enough, to become legends in our own way, in our own time, for our own reasons. This is the eternal legacy of the Vikings, not their weapons or their ships or their conquests, but their example, the proof, the demonstration that it can be done. That ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, that limitations can be overcome, that greatness is possible, that courage matters, that we can matter, that we can be remembered, that we can be great. The blood has been spilled, the storms have been weathered, the ships have sailed, the battles have been fought, the age has ended, but the story lives on, forever, in every heart that hears it and feels that spark of inspiration, in every person who decides they will not accept their limits, in every soul that chooses to dare greatly rather than live safely. The Vikings live on in their descendants, in their influence, in their example, in their story, in us, if we choose to let them. If we choose to embrace their courage, if we choose to follow their example, if we choose to be great. The Viking age is over. Long live the Vikings, long live their courage, long live their spirit, long live their legend, long live the truth they proved with their lives, that humans are capable of extraordinary things, that we can overcome any obstacle, that we can achieve legendary feats, that we can matter, that we can be remembered, that we can be great, that we can sail into the storm and emerge as legends, that we can come from nothing and become everything, that we can live brief, mortal lives and achieve immortal glory. This is what the Vikings taught us. This is what they proved. This is their eternal gift across 1,000 years. Not just a story, but a truth. Not just history, but inspiration. Not just the past, but a guide for the future. For your future, for what you can become if you have the courage to try. The saga is told, the storm has passed, the blood has dried, but the echo remains, forever, the echo of dragon ships cutting through northern seas, the echo of warriors standing in shield walls, the echo of explorers sailing into unknown oceans, the echo of people who refused to accept their limitations and made themselves legendary through courage and deeds, the echo that says, you can do this too, you can be great, you can matter, you can be remembered. All you need is the courage to try. The Vikings had that courage, and they used it to become immortal. What will you do with yours?